Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So, we're in the book of Nehemiah, and I always have a tendency to joke with my high school Bible class, and I always ask, who is the shortest person in the Bible? Some people say Nehemiah, but we know the shortest person in the Bible is actually Bildad the Shuhite. He's a little shorter. All right, so let's get on with the book. So the timeline of Nehemiah extends like this. So the first deportation, second and third, we see were some time ago. 586 BC was the destruction of Jerusalem in Nebuchadnezzar's third swing down to take the rest of everybody from Jerusalem and destroy it. Then we have Cyrus's decree, which would be connected with the rebuilding of the temple in the book of Ezra. Esther occurs between Ezra chapter 6 and 7 in the chronology. We saw that in the overview of Ezra. And then Esther returns in chapter 7 through the rest of the book of Ezra, and then we have Nehemiah 445 BC when he received the instructions, the decree that he could go back and rebuild from Artaxerxes Longimanus. So that's the overall timeline, matches up really with that of Ezra, and we have a number of timelines that we've laid out in Ezra. So the Persian Empire, where Artaxerxes ruled, was a pretty large area. So we see that Nehemiah started out in Shushan the palace that was in Persia, and then he would be going to Jerusalem. So we see that the Persian Empire had really ruled over an enormous area in the Middle East, and that's what we see represented there, even down to South Africa. So large area after they defeated the Babylonian Empire. So the outline for Nehemiah looks like this. The first 7 chapters deals with the rebuilding of the walls. So in chapter 1, he gets the bad news from those from Jerusalem who came to share with him what was going on, and it disturbed him. And in chapter 2, Artaxerxes ends up giving him the decree, actually, the paperwork, the authority to go back to Jerusalem. And then he experiences problems as soon as he gets back. But chapter 2 is that transitional chapter where he goes before the king, and the king grants him the right to go back. So the opposition that he gets, we see in Nehemiah 2:10. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Amorite official heard of it, this is on his return back, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. Now this is from an old cartoon back in the 50s. We have Spike and Chester, and Chester was the brains and Spike was the brawn, and then we can look at that as Sanballat and Tobiah. So cute little rendition there. And in chapter 3 we have the gates of Jerusalem. So Nehemiah went back, and for 3 days he talked to nobody. He just scouted out these gates on his own. He had to figure out what he was going to do, and then obviously get God's help in dealing with it and God's wisdom in how to set up a plan. So here is the outline of the walls in Nehemiah, right? And then we have in the white the present old city walls, and then the temple walls, the Temple Mount. Really in the New Testament we see that Temple Mount area in red. So notice on the right-hand side here, we have the Kidron Valley. That is the valley that goes really alongside of Jerusalem, which you typically see in pictures as you're looking from the Mount of Olives, which would be over here. Then we have the Tyropian Valley that really works its way through, and the Valley of Hinnom in the southern part down here. Now, the Valley of Hinnom originally was called the Valley of Tophet. Tophet is the Hebrew word for drums, and that is where they sacrificed children to Molech. They would have this enormous ritual where they would have a fire path that they walked up, and so that they would walk up, and they'd be beating these drums to drown out the screaming cries of the children that would be laid on the red-hot arms of Molech, which is this big bronze statue that had a hole in it in the back, and they would basically kindle a fire on the inside. The statue would be red hot with these outstretched arms, and they would put their babies, their unwanted children, on the hands of Molech, and they would sacrifice them to that god. And it was so detestable to the Jews later on that they actually made the Valley of Hinnom the place of garbage. Now, interestingly enough, Jesus talked about how it was better to go to heaven maimed than to go whole to hell. And the word that's used in the New Testament is Gehenna, which is really the Valley of Hinnom. And so he was trying to give a word picture from the garbage dump where all the useless refuge goes, and where the worm doesn't die and the fire isn't quenched. It was a place of stench and rot and just maggots, and it was awful. And so Jesus was saying, whatever you do, you don't want to end up there. There's no value there. That's where everything is thrown out. So if you want to look that up on your own, that's in Mark chapter 9. Now, as we go around here, we have the different gates in Nehemiah 3. It starts off with the sheep gate. Then it goes to the fish gate, which is a main gate. The old gate, which is a main gate. And that's actually a picture of it right there. And then we have the Valley Gate, which is a main gate. The Refuge Gate, right? That's where they brought the garbage out to the Valley of Hinnom. And, you know, there's nothing mystical about the names of these gates. Now, I know that people teach the book of Nehemiah, and they make a lot of mystical names and spiritualize them and everything. However, they just meant what they meant. You know, the Refuge Gate was the gate that they took the garbage out through. You know, the Valley Gate led to the Valley of Hinnom. And so they were just named after what their function was. I know that people like to sermonize and do a lot of that. The Fountain Gate, right, was where you had access outside to a fountain. And then you move on up to the Water Gate, right? Again, that was an inner gate as opposed to a main gate. And as we go up further, we hit the horse gate. Well, what do you think they use that for? To go in and out with the horses. We had the eastern gate. That's the one that is actually currently blocked up. And that you see from the Mount of Olives if a picture is taken from there. And then you have the Hifkad Gate, or which really means muster or assembly. It was a place where people would assemble together or gather together to muster. So that's kind of the layout of the gates and the wall that Nehemiah would end up rebuilding. So, chapter 4, Nehemiah has external attacks. this is opposition from ridicule. We get it from Sanballat and Tobiah. And then they also had discouragement because of trash. You know, when we bought our building back in 1998, you know, we're in a large, originally it was Grants, but Kmart bought it, so everybody looks at it as an old Kmart building. It's a 73,000 square foot building. So when we were fixing it, I mean, it was kind of unused for a number of years before we bought it. And when we were fixing it, it was difficult to get the trash moved out. You had to, you know, we would go in there, we'd work at night. There'd be workers every night till 11 or 12 o'clock. Guys would come down after work, and ladies. But if there were, everybody wanted to do building stuff, but if the trash could not be moved out of the way, you couldn't build. There was just no space. You need room to work. You need a clear area, and so trash was causing a discouragement because they couldn't get rid of it. And this was something, again, that Nehemiah had to deal with. But the opposition from the ridicule of Sanballat and Tobiah was just designed to try to discourage along with everything else. Now, we need to realize the book of Nehemiah is telling us about going against the current of the world. Dead fish float down with the world's current. So the current goes the direction that everybody understands, but only live fish, like the salmon, can swim against the current. The rest of them float along. So as Christians, we want to swim against the current of the world. And so we want to go the other way and let the dead fish float down the river. So I bring that up because it's important to understand that we are going to have spiritual opposition. Nehemiah had opposition. Now, his was a lot of physical opposition, and certainly Christians in different areas of the world have physical opposition. We don't necessarily have it in our own country at this point in time. I mean, yes, we can get ridiculed because we're Christians, or people make fun of us or tell us we're crazy or whatever. But, you know, nobody is risking their lives going home from church or a Bible study because people find them, you know, leaving a church building and then they're going to go after them. There are some countries that it's very dangerous to be a Christian, but that's not what we're facing right now. So what we need to do is be able to stand strong against the constant current of the world that is against us. It's against the truth of God. It's against the ideology that we have as Christians. As we stand in the truth and we think clearly and logically and reasonably about God, about nature, science, and everything that we have to deal with in relation to reality. In other words, what is real in life and what is myth. People believe a lot of nutty things, so we'll be in constant conflict with them, but we don't want to float along with the dead. We want to move against them because we're alive. So, all right, moving on. In chapter 5, we see there's the attacks go from being external to internal, and there's greed and heartless leadership. Now, this was a problem. Basically, as you read through, you realize what was happening is people, they couldn't afford a lot of what they had. Almost like a little bit now with the coronavirus, where people have lost jobs, they're going through difficult times. Businesses have to shut down and everything. Well, when they came back to begin to build, you know, people, they still had mortgages on their land, but some of the wealthy leadership, you know, that had come back, and Jews that still owned different areas of land and had more money than the common person, they would take advantage of that. And oftentimes, because the person could not afford the mortgage on their property, they would buy them out. That was not doing them any favors. God wanted families to be able to keep their property because it got passed down to the next generation of that family line. This was important. It goes over it all in the Old Testament, but it was important because it wasn't like Israel was expanding. So it wasn't like there was going to be more land available. Each tribe was allotted their land originally, and that's how it was laid out. So the leadership had become greedy. They were taking unfortunate advantage of the misfortune and the poverty of a lot of the Jews that had come back from Babylon and were struggling financially. And it was the wrong thing to do. So Nehemiah, however, he was a model for leadership. This is a leadership book. Nehemiah is like one of my heroes. In chapter 5, it says, "Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah." Now, Nehemiah was the governor during the time that he was back. He was the one overseeing all the work. Notice it says, "Neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provision." They didn't take any advantage. In other words, people needed to support the governor and the governor's staff and everything else. But Nehemiah said, hey, I'm not going to be forcing people to do that. That's not right. They don't have it to give, right? And he goes on, he says, "But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine besides 40 shekels of silver." So they were receiving, tithes from them, in a sense, tax money, so that they could live more luxuriously than the other people. But they were putting a burden on them that they couldn't actually meet. He says, "Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God." Now, that is going to be the major difference between any leader, Old Testament, New Testament, spiritual leader, pastor. If a person has the fear of God personally, then they will do what God says, God's way. If they don't, they will be charlatans. They'll rip off God's people. We'll get into that a little more in a minute. He goes on to say, "Indeed, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land." In other words, Nehemiah involved himself with the work, and he didn't take land from people that could not afford to keep it. He says, "All my servants were gathered there for the work." In other words, everybody with Nehemiah on his team, they all swung a hammer, in a sense. "And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us." So Nehemiah was feeding all these people. "Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox, 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine." He says, notice this last sentence, "Yet in spite of this," in other words, with all this provision, "I did not demand the governor's provision because the bondage was heavy on this people." And so what Nehemiah is saying, even though I had a heavy load to bear because of the people I needed to feed, from the ones that we were bringing in and the ones that were doing the work and everything else, even though I was responsible to handle these people, I did not put the burden on everybody else to do it. Quite a guy. Now, so we can see from that, number one, Nehemiah lived like the people he oversaw. He was not living like one of the privileged elite. That is always wrong. That's never the right thing to do. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody can't have more than somebody else. Obviously, we're all in a little bit of a different situation when it comes to that. But Nehemiah was not, he wasn't living in the lap of luxury while everybody else was struggling. He didn't take financial advantage of the people. In other words, he wasn't he wasn't utilizing their misfortune to take advantage of them. He actually did the opposite. He gave them aid and he supported them. He worked alongside of the people, right? So he was contributing to the work with others. He was one of them. He wasn't different from them. He was engaged. And Nehemiah used his God-given authority as the governor for God's glory, not for personal advantage. There's way too much of that happening in the Christian world, where leaders use the position that they have, and I would say many times it's not God-given, for personal advantage, and it's wrong. But they'll answer to God for that. Leaders and money, big issue, right? So leaders, especially pastors and spiritual leaders, should not use their position or the money given by people for the support of God's work to grow their own personal wealth or extort money from God's people. I mean, I hope you can see how that would be wrong. Secondly, money given to God's work should go to the work and necessary support of leaders. I mean, look, even Paul says, the labor in Jesus, the labor is worthy of his hire. If you have a pastor, a spiritual leader that's doing work, they need to be supported. Otherwise, they have to go get a job and they can't do what they're doing. And we all understand that. But that's what's necessary. But it's not designed, the giving of money to God's work is not designed to line the pockets of greedy pastors or unaccountable spiritual leaders. Spiritual leaders who are just taking and raking in the money, and the more that comes in, the more they make, and there's no end to it. It gets up into the hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars, which is disgraceful and always gives Jesus a black eye. The Bible makes it clear that when money is the focus or main feature or theme of a ministry, it's not of God, but of man, or even worse, it can be of the devil. This is a real problem today. There are so many ministries that are pushing the money issue. Obviously we can think about the health and wealth people that focus on finance. Their idea of prosperity, especially in other countries, only works with them. And even here, unfortunately, people get sucked into their scripture twisting and end up, giving them all their money until they're sick and broke. And then they leave, and then it's the rest of us that actually have to pick up the damaged pieces of what a lot of these prosperity gospel preachers do to people. A false teacher is easily characterized by their greed and love of money that Jesus said was not to be served, right? Otherwise, God would not be served. In other words, Jesus says you can't serve God and mammon or God and money. You got to make a decision, one or the other. But I think it's very easy to see if we just take a step back and look who's serving money and who's serving God. Don't let some of the words fool you in some of the work that's being done by some of these charlatans. Now, Peter echoes this same principle. In 1 Peter 5, the first 4 verses, he says, he's writing to the elders which are among you, I exhort, who am also an elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. So here's his instruction, feed. The word means to shepherd. Shepherd has the job implication of protecting, leading, encouraging, discipling, guarding, guiding, and feeding. So he says shepherd or feed the flock of God. Tells you whose flock it is. It's not the person's. It's God's flock. He owns them. Which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, in other words, not being forced, but willingly, right? Desiring to do it for a godly reason, not for filthy lucre. I left the old King James in there. I love that word. It comes from the Latin word that means lucrative, right? pastors commercializing their ministry and getting rich off of God's people. That's, in other words, Peter is saying you don't do it for that reason. I mean, it's as plain and simple as you can get. He says, but of a ready mind. In other words, with eagerness and enthusiasm. Neither as being lords over God's heritage, because they're blood-bought people. Jesus Christ purchased our lives. He's the one that shed his blood. There is no pastor that has that claim to anybody. And they should not be lords over God's people in that way, but be examples to the flock. That's how you lead. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, that's give account time, you shall receive a crown of glory that fades not away, unless you're a charlatan and you've been ripping off God's people. And that's a meeting that I certainly don't want to be near. Now, Paul did the same thing. To the Thessalonians, he said, for our appeal to you does not spring from deceit, impure motives, or trickery. He says, rather, because we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, we speak as we do, not trying to please people, but God, who tests our motives. As you know, we did not come with flattering words or with a scheme to make money. So every time somebody has a scheme to make money, they always have flattering words. That's why Paul puts them together here, because the goal is that if you say something harsh or something somebody doesn't want to hear, well, you're not going to make any money from them. They're not going to give you anything. So he says, God is our witness. We did not seek praise from people, from you or from anyone else, even though as apostles of the Messiah, we might have made such demands. In other words, Paul did have authority as an apostle, and they could have. Indeed, we were gentle among you like a nursing mother tenderly caring for her own children. We cared so deeply for you that we were determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives. Paul is extending himself, just like Nehemiah. I mean, he obviously used Nehemiah as a model. That is how dear you were to us. Brothers, you remember our labor and toil. We worked night and day so that we would not become a burden to any of you while we proclaim the gospel of God to you. I mean, think about what happens today with a lot of the prosperity gospel preachers. They go into a place and they don't work night and day. They actually require people support them because of what they're bringing them, which is obviously a different gospel. He says, you and God are witnesses of how pure, honest, and blameless our conduct was among you who believe. The Thessalonians could sit there and say, yeah, hey, that's how Paul lived among us. That's how his team lived. They were straight up. They were honest. They were honorable. There was no deceit. There was no mishandling. There was no question about their motives or how they dealt with money or anything else. He says, finally, you know very well that we treated each of you the way a father treats his children. We comforted and encouraged you, urging you to live in a manner worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and glory. So can't wait to meet the Apostle Paul. He and Nehemiah, two of my heroes. Now, some other related scriptures. 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 7. Elders, so we're talking about leaders, they should be not greedy of filthy lucre, right? Just desiring to get rich off their ministry. In 1 Timothy 6, he says, they that will or desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, there are some people that just go after the dough, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Now, that doesn't mean when he says erred from the faith that they're not Christians anymore. They're still doing the same thing. Otherwise, he wouldn't be telling people earlier in the chapter to stay away from them. That wasn't the issue. The issue is that they've erred from the faith by getting into the money and making finances and wealth the focus of their ministry. 2 Peter 2:3 says, in their greed, they will exploit you with deceptive words. That word exploit means to do business, and it's about money for false teachers. That's the context of what Peter's talking. He's warning. In Jeremiah 6:3 in the Old Testament, and in 8, we have two identical verses. It says, from the least of them, even to the greatest of them, everyone is given to covetousness, and from the prophet even to the priest, everyone deals falsely. That's why God brought judgment. That's Jeremiah's message. Judgment that was coming, and they would end up in Babylon because of it. That was one of the main problems. And then Micah 3:11, her leaders, and Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah, which is just before Jeremiah, her leaders judge for money, so you'd only get justice if you paid for it. Her priests teach only when they're paid. You want a Bible study? Cash out, you got to get the, fork over the dough. And her prophets prophesy for cash. So basically, you wanted something spiritual, then you needed to hand over some money. There was a transaction. It was a business. That's how it's done. And unfortunately, it's still done today. So chapter 6, Nehemiah has personal attacks against him. They try to get him to go to a city, getting away from the work, city called Oh No. And what does he say? Oh no, I'm not going. I'm not going to distract myself from the work. Even though he had personal attacks and threats and evil schemes against him, he just trusted God. He prayed, and then the wall was finished in chapter 6. How long did it take? Easy to remember. The wall was finished in 52 days. There's 52 weeks in a year, and Nehemiah finished that wall in 52 days. They worked night and day. Nehemiah, it was just genius. He positioned people along the wall near where they lived. They had a trowel in one hand to do work and a sword in the other in case they were attacked. They were always on guard. He set them in shifts. Great book. Read the book. It's just fantastic. Just so many principles of leadership. We'll go over that in the end anyway. So the wall is finished. Nehemiah prays after the personal threats, and this is what he says. My God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. These were people coming against Nehemiah personally. So, I don't know if we can appreciate the fact this guy had a huge responsibility of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and establishing all this, and then at the same time, the personal pressure of having all these people against him. Just an amazing guy. And think about this. He was only back, and we'll see in a minute, for a short time. He didn't live in Jerusalem. He was in Persia. He was like Daniel. He was faithful outside of Israel, doing the work for God, being a witness for God, even though he was not where he wanted to be. When the wall was finished, it says, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. So 52 days it took to finish. And then finally, Nehemiah turns Jerusalem over to the governors. This is the last of the first half of the book. In chapter 7, and Jerusalem is placed in good hands. Nehemiah placed Jerusalem in the hands of faithful governors. He says, then I put my brother Hananiah in charge of Jerusalem, along with Hananiah, commander of the fortress, because he was a faithful man who feared God more than most. Man, that is so rare then and today, to have somebody that is a faithful, trustworthy leader who also fears God. And that's their personal motivation. Paul echoes the same thing. He said it is required in stewards, the word means managers, that a man be found faithful, trustworthy. It never changes. It's the same. It's the same today as it's always been. So the second part of the book is the restoration of the people. We had the wall restored, now we have the people restored. So there's a renewal of the covenant in chapter 8 through 10. And this is how it lays out. The law is read by Ezra. And in chapter 8, it says, he read the law, and then there were other priests and Levites throughout the crowd who would then, because not everybody could be heard, but they stood there all day, and as he went through the law, then he would give an explanation of what he read, what it meant, and then they would explain it. They were kind of his loudspeaker system to the rest of the crowd, and they would pass it on out so that everybody would have understanding. This is really the foundation for expositional teaching. Expositional Bible teaching is basically verse by verse, uncovering what the verse means in its context. The reason that it is so important to learn the Bible in that way is because without it, you can't learn the Bible. You cannot learn the Bible topically. You know, this is a pet peeve of mine. We've had people come into our church that have been Christians for 5, 10, 15, and even 20 years, and they really don't know the Bible. They've listened to Bible teachings most of their life, but they don't know what the Bible teaches. They know about certain spiritual principles, they know about certain Bible topics and everything, but they don't know the Bible. And that disarms them in their working knowledge of the Word to be able to have basic discernment. We are supposed to know the Bible in context. It may not be as exciting to learn it like that because it's work, okay? It's work going through every verse. It's work, doing, putting in the effort to learn what the Bible is saying in its context, thinking through it, getting some good commentaries, looking up the definition of words in a Strong's Concordance. It's work, okay? However, there's no other way to learn the Bible. You can't learn it by just plucking verses here and there or getting favorite verses. The Bible is not a fortune cookie. It's not a bowl with a bunch of fortune cookies in it, and then you pull out the one that you like, what it says, and then you throw away the rest. That's not the design of the Bible. The Bible is a living, breathing book that is the Word of God. It's from God's mouth to our ears, and that's how it should be received and studied with that same air of respect and dignity. Now, there's nothing wrong with topical sermons. They can be a huge advantage. However, if they supplant the verse-by-verse teaching of the Bible, the people under that teaching, though they may enjoy the topics, they will never learn the Bible. There is no way for it to happen. But let's get off that subject, otherwise we'll keep on going. But this was the foundation for the expositional Bible teaching that we experience today in the churches that do it. It's more work for the pastor. He has to spend time studying and making sure that his doctrine is correct, but it is the safeguard for the people of that church. All right, so number 2, the people repent in chapters 9 and 10, and they have to put away their pagan wives. We're back to the same problem we saw in Ezra. And then we see the obedience of the people to that covenant that they made to be devoted to God in chapter 11 to 13. So the people were assigned places to live in and out of the city in chapter 11. So Nehemiah, they would establish what families were going to have what area, because if you were going to be in the city, it was a different responsibility than if you were going to be living out on the farm. So in the city, you had to commit yourself to the responsibility that you would have there. Chapter 12, the priests for ministry and the walls were dedicated. So the priests were established and what they were going to do, and the walls were dedicated. Now, this is Nehemiah's timeline. He visited Jerusalem twice. The first time, we see it here, and then between this time and then the second time, He was back in Shushan, and then he returns at the end. So Nehemiah had 2 trips. He wasn't there a long time. He had to go back to Shushan, and then he came back again to fix some problems. We'll see what those are. So Nehemiah returns to fix problems. Chapter 13, again, one of my favorite chapters because I really love Nehemiah. And so first of all, when he gets back, he finds out that Tobiah the Ammonite, he's living in the temple. He took a room that was designed to store what the people brought to the temple for God as tithes, to put in that, we learn about the storehouse in Malachi. Well, that was the temple. They had these rooms where they would put stuff in. They had to house the grain or whatever was brought from people for their tithes to support the Levites. There's actually 3 tithes in the Old Testament. People say, well, I want a tithe. Well, if you want a tithe, you give 23 1/3% a year, because there was the first tithe, or 10th, which was to support the Levites, because they had no land. They could not go work a job. They couldn't farm. They couldn't do anything like that to earn money to live. So God had everybody give 10% to them. They contributed it towards them. Then the second 10% was for the temple. Again, it was a tax, really, for the Levites, and then for the temple, and then finally one that was done every 3rd year or over 3 years, 10% over 3 years, and that was for strangers, people who had come from other countries that would proselytize into Israel, and almost kind of a support program for them and people that had needs, because if you were a Gentile, you came from another country, you didn't have any land. You had to go work for somebody. The land was already just established by lot, and so Joshua did that. So each tribe knew the area that they were supposed to be in, that they had responsibility for, and everything. So it wasn't like you could just come from another country and then just like claim a piece of land. This wasn't the Wild West. So they needed to have something in lieu of support for these people and for other people that fell on hard times. So that was that 3rd tithe over a 10-year period. And then what Nehemiah does after and again, Tobiah was in the temple because there was a marriage relationship between the priest, one of the priests, and Tobiah and his family. So, that's why we're not supposed to be unequally yoked. 2 Corinthians 6. Not only for marriage, but for business or anything like that, because the problem is it brings together 2 worlds, light and dark. How do you connect those 2 and not compromise and create a problem? So anyways, another teaching for another time. But then Nehemiah realizes that nobody's really tithing properly to support the Levites. They're not getting their support, and they're out trying to get jobs. So, they're trying to, log some hours in on a farm here or there, or help somebody out so that they can get food to eat and feed their families, because there was no tithes, which meant the temple was not functioning the way that it was supposed to, and it was not a place where God was properly worshipped. So he straightened that out. Then he corrected the violations of the Sabbath. So what was happening on the Sabbath day was the Gentiles would come in. They would kind of have these traveling caravans that would come inside the walls of Jerusalem, and then they'd set up this market area and sell their wares. Well, what the Jews were doing was they were getting distracted from the Sabbath day and worshiping God, and basically going shopping. So what Nehemiah did was he ended up, he talked to these merchants that would come, and he said, look, he said, this is not going to happen on the Sabbath day anymore. He said, you guys come again. He said, and I'll lay hands on you. And I tell you, he wasn't talking about praying for them. Okay. You got to love this guy, you know? So anyways, he makes sure that happens. And then he has the gates of Jerusalem closed and locked, and he sets guards on them to make sure that it's not going to happen. So he doesn't just say something like a politician and then just kind of go on his merry way. He makes sure that he follows through and gets the work done. So the Sabbath would not be dishonored. Look, the Sabbath was the sign of the covenant of Moses between Israel and God. Every covenant has a sign. Circumcision was the Abrahamic covenant. The Sabbath day, which is why it's not repeated in the New Testament, out of the 10 commandments, only 9 of the 10 are repeated as things that we are obligated to do morally, because the Sabbath day is not a moral obligation for the church. Even though there's a lot of Christians that are getting very Jewish and trying to make people feel as though if I wear some Jewish prayer robes, they try to sell those things on TV. I mean, the stuff that's out there is crazy. But there's a whole movement of the church towards trying to make Gentiles more Jewish so that they can feel more spiritual and be more connected to Jesus, and Jesus was Jewish and all this stuff. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. That's not the gospel. The gospel has nothing to do with that. That is legalism that is being thrust on people that are spiritually poor, that feel as though if they do something more physical or tangible, that they will become more spiritual. It doesn't work like that. That's not what's going to make you more spiritual. G. Campbell Morgan said, and I can't agree with him more, years ago, he said, the less material you are, the less tangible in your relationship with the God, the more spiritual that you are in your relationship with God. Because the problem is, if I need some trinket or some idol or some physical assist to help me remember God or feel like I'm connected with God, all the different things that are they get the all the amulets and everything else that they have with some of these movements within Christianity to make people feel more spiritual. They're actually deteriorating spiritually. They're becoming less spiritual because what's happening is they're relying on some physical, tangible piece of something in order to sense their closeness to God, which the sense that they have is emotional. It has nothing to do with anything spiritual. That is not a spiritual sense. A spiritual sense is not necessarily always felt. It's obeyed. It's something that is aligned with the truth. So today we've entered into, and I go into this in the overview of Colossians in chapter 2, but we've gotten to the place in the church where it's become very sensual. And I don't mean sexual, though there's those problems too. I mean it's sensual in relation to our senses. We need to feel God. We need to touch God as though he's there physically. God is spirit, and they that worship him in spirit and in truth, Jesus said in John 4:24. So it has nothing to do with an emotional feeling that I have. I can be feeling nothing in worshiping God in truth, because the truth is not emotion. The truth is the truth. The truth is absolute. And so I'm supposed to, the Bible tells me, to obey the truth, to walk in it, and then that is spiritual. Spirituality is not an emotional feeling. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have an emotional feeling, but feelings and emotions and the sense of sensual, my five senses and all this other stuff, that's not spirituality. That's not the basis of determining it. And you have a lot of this stuff in Christianity is such a nonsense, and these, quite frankly, a lot of these quacks on television that are trying to get people to do things that are much more mystical and sensual. And what people are doing is they're relying on their senses and their emotions to try to develop their spirituality. They're going in the wrong direction. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Faith does not come by emotion. It doesn't come by feeling. Okay? When you have a sense of something, because it's the Holy Spirit, it's not necessarily emotional. It's usually based on conviction. And the conviction is founded in the truth found in the Word of God. But anyways, Nehemiah corrects this violation on the Sabbath. And then finally, he has to do something that Ezra did. He has to rebuke the intermarriages. It's a repeat problem. Now, the difference between Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra, he tore his own beard out. Nehemiah, he tore other people's beards out. So, again, I can't help really loving this guy, and I can't wait to meet him. Him and the Apostle Paul. If I have one favorite guy from the Old Testament, I really, really admire Nehemiah and the Apostle Paul. I cannot wait to meet him. Just these guys are heroes. So, as an end to this book, here is a list from a book called Nehemiah, Man in Charge, on page 23 by Donald Campbell. And these are the principles for effective leadership. He draws these out in Nehemiah. Number one, he established a reasonable and attainable goal. Much of this is common sense. He had a sense of mission. He was willing to get involved, which a lot of leaders don't want to be. He rearranged his priorities in order to accomplish his goal. In other words, he adjusted himself to the need, right? Didn't have everybody adjust to him. He patiently waited for God's timing because it's God's work, right? He showed respect to his superior. That's called being accountable. We don't have a lot of that today. He prayed at crucial times. He made his request with tact and graciousness when he had to request. He was well prepared and thought of his needs in advance. In other words, he was a planner. And again, that comes from prayer too. He went through proper channels. He didn't always do an end run. There's so many people, they do whatever they can to get to the senior pastor. I know him, or this or that. And the problem is, we really need to, unless it's an emergency, go through proper channels for stuff, because otherwise we're just taking shortcuts because we want a special favor. And it's not right. There's no integrity there. He took time, 3 days, to rest and pray and plan. That's when he first got to Jerusalem. He investigated the situation firsthand. He didn't just listen to others. He wanted to know. He went through each of those gates. He informed others only after he knew the size of the problem. He didn't overstate it. He didn't understate it. He found out what the issue was, and then he dealt with it straight up. Number 14, he identified himself as one with the people. We went through that. He set before them a reasonable and attainable goal, right? That's how he set up around the wall and had everybody doing their responsible thing. He assured them God was in the project, and he could be confident of that. He wasn't just blowing smoke. He knew that because God was leading him all the way. And he had the indication of that. He displayed self-confidence in facing obstacles, right? He didn't run away from them. He didn't get, all wigged out and weird over it. He knew God was with him. And he displayed, and that should be a capital G, for God's confidence in facing obstacles. Okay? And then he did not argue with opponents. He just kept to the work. He was not discouraged by opposition, which is easy to happen. That's why you have to keep focused on God and the work. He courageously used the authority of his position. And then 21 is the last one. Now, I actually went and capitalized that. I just paused the video for a second and capitalized He displayed God's confidence in facing obstacles because obviously God is sovereign and God has control over everything. And so there's no issue with getting the work done. Now, it's important to note that when God says the work is going to get done, it'll get done. Now, we have to figure out how God wants us to do it, and we do it, and we align with what he's doing and following his lead. However, if God sends Nehemiah back to build a wall, that wall is going to get built one way or the other. And if not with Nehemiah, he'll take somebody else. But God's purpose cannot be thwarted, okay? There are things that God allows. Obviously, he allows people their free will. That's why there's evil in the world. The devil is the small g god of this world, 2 Corinthians 4:4. But God is in charge. He reigns supreme. Though right now, he is allowing evil to run its course, but eventually, evil is going to be quarantined in hell, right? Now, I would personally add to this list that he was not greedy for financial advancement. This is kind of a little more up to date with our comparisons. He had a heart for God first, which properly gave him a heart for God's people. Look, if you have a leader that doesn't have a heart for God personally, they're not going to have a heart for God's work. They're going to have a heart for themselves. They're only going to be interested in themselves, not in God getting the glory and receiving all the credit for the work that's done, because it's really him doing it. He just gives us the privilege of being involved. Number 3, he had model integrity and righteousness in all his actions. Nehemiah, I mean, you couldn't shoot a hole in anything he was doing. I mean, he was just straight up, just a great example. And then finally, he was faithful, whether in Shushan or Jerusalem. I know Christians over the years that, they love to be faithful at church, and then they go to work and they're awful. And that's not right. Integrity comes from the word integer, one, right? So we should be the same whether we're at home, at work, at church. In other words, we shouldn't be putting on a different face no matter where we're at. We should just be the same all the time. Now, I realize people go home and they relax, and for those who have it anyways, they let their hair down or whatever, and I understand all that. We relax at home. But we still need to be cautious. We need to make sure that the way we are before others is really the way we are before God, and that is part of the sanctification process. So anyways, I love the book of Nehemiah. It's a great book. He's a great guy. Again, can't wait to meet him. But hopefully this gave you at least a good overview for the book of Nehemiah. Again, if you want to understand leadership in any capacity, you got to study this book. And may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.